And welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to crisis management, disaster recovery, business continuity, emergency response, and anything that can touch those realms. And as always, I like to mention if there's a subject you'd like us to talk about on the show, if you go to the show's webpage on the Voice America site, you can click on a button that sends me an email and you can tell me what you'd like to hear, or if yourself want to be on the show, you can let me know that as well, or we'll try find somebody to talk about the subject you want us to touch on, and we'll bring that person on. I've mentioned in the past that I attended in May the Continuity and Resilience Today conference. Great conference and met a lot of great people and spoke to some of the presenters and asked them if they'd be interested on being on the show. And today's guest is one of those presenters. His topic was cybersecurity and crisis management, lessons learned from integration. So I thought that was an interesting topic, and there were some really good things that I thought he brought up. So hopefully we remember what those are and talk about them here today. But I'd like to welcome to the show Douglas Grant. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, you had a great topic, on the at the conference. So I'm really happy to have you here. Can you give us a short bio of yourself? What you do right now, and how you got into the emergency response business continuity realm.
Sure. So I've been involved in emergency management for about 10 years now. I actually started as an Army reservist, and my first experiences in the area were doing major exercises related to aid to civil power. So if you think of kind of the military's response to a major natural disaster in Canada, that was really my first involvement in this kind of area. And once I got out of the military, I decided it was something that I wanted to focus my career on. So I ended up doing the undergraduate degree in emergency management from York University, followed that with a master's degree in emergency management from Railroads, and I took a job with Atomic Energy of Canada after Fukushima. So it was at a time when the organization was really trying to implement a number of lessons learned from that event. So it was an opportunity for me to go in and implement a number of kind of emergency management programs with a nuclear organization. Since then, I've been working with a company called Calian, where I'm one of the senior emergency management consultants. So we do emergency management projects for government, critical infrastructure, private industry across Canada.
Can I ask what attracted you to this kind of industry? What was it that kind of stood out for you?
I think it had a strong overlap with my kind of military background. And when I was in the military, I actually had a career-ending injury. I tore a bunch of the ligaments in my ankle, and I was looking for something that was still kind of involved in public safety and security. And I kind of remembered my experiences with those aid to civil power domestic exercises, and thought this would actually be a really good fit given that background.
Oh, I always like to hear how people get into the industry. It's so interesting to hear the different backgrounds. So
there's no one way to do it.
No, it seems to just be a very, very wide spectrum here. So let's get started into your talk at CRT. The cybersecurity, it's relatively a new term. Can you define what that is for us?
Well, first of all, I would probably have to say that there's more technical people who would do a better job than me, but my personal definition of it is examining how an organization can protect its both critical assets and its kind of property, both physical and intellectual, from an unwanted intrusion by any kind of external power or any kind of external attacker. So there's obviously a number of aspects of that fall under different areas. My personal focus within emergency management has always been, if some kind of a major disruption happens, that's not simply related to, a loss of a low-level income or something like that, if an intrusion actually has such like an extreme impact on an organization that it poses a direct risk to people, that's been my kind of personal focus to cybersecurity.
Okay. And so, what's the current state of cybersecurity? How does it stand right now?
Overall, at least in my personal experiences, dealing with a lot of different organizations who deal with things like critical infrastructure, the current state is that, like you say, it is a new field. It's something that's starting to be understood, but there are a number of challenges with integrating cybersecurity into those kind of business continuity, disaster recovery, emergency management frameworks that a lot of organizations do have in place. There's a number of reasons for that, but I think that one of the major ones is just that, as you say, one, it's a newer field and there's not a lot of understanding at different levels of the organization about specific methodologies that go into effective cybersecurity.
Do you think that maybe some of these existing industries like emergency response, business continuity, IT, DRP, they can help contribute to build cybersecurity industry and really help refine it so it does become a lot more better understood?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I think that resilience practitioners overall focus on is building connections between various parts of an organization. I think that's really where one of the challenges is right now. A lot of organizations that are focusing on cybersecurity are still having it kind of operate in isolation. There's not those connections to the other parts of the organization that may have expertise that can help cybersecurity practitioners respond to an incident as a whole or as an entire organization. It's still being done very much in a kind of in a focus that's away from the way that the organization would handle other kind of disruptions like business continuity disruptions.
Is that really because it is so new, or because people don't really want to add another piece to this, very big, focus? There, emergency response, disaster recovery, privacy concerns, business continuity, and now another one, cybersecurity.
That's actually a really interesting point. I would say that I think that certainly factors into it. But from what I've seen so far, at least, the issues around cybersecurity in terms of, privacy concerns and those kind of things are really secondary just to the idea that, people don't understand what an intrusion in terms of cybersecurity actually is. It's easy to understand a fire or a flood or, an explosion or a conventional emergency like that. And there's systems in place that are fairly widespread that focus on those kind of disruptions. But if you were to ask the average employee, talk me through what exactly a cyber intrusion looks like, for the most part, they're not really going to have a solid understanding. And even as a resilience practitioner myself, cybersecurity is not my primary focus. I can help organizations leverage existing parts to deal with an overall response or an overall intrusion. But if you actually ask me to walk you through the minute technical details of that, that's not going to be something that I have a strong understanding of. So if you have organizational leaders who are trying to develop some kind of a cybersecurity capacity, if they're not really understanding the most kind of fundamental concepts of it, it's going to be challenging for them to make sure that they're developing a system that responds effectively to these disruptions.
So they could be relying on people within their organization for this expertise who themselves may not have all the skills and knowledge about it because it's so new and all the different pieces out there.
Right. I think that's a good point. And if you look at a lot of organizations that have, an actual emergency management capacity right now, a lot of them are under like a health, safety, security, and environmental program, HSSE or some variation of that. If you think about how different environmental management is from security, it's going to be tough to have a manager or director who's in charge of all of those different aspects, who has a really strong understanding of each one of those disciplines. Ideally, the organizations are going to have specific managers who are in charge of each one of those aspects that report to an overall manager, but you can't really guarantee that. So if you have, that kind of cybersecurity framework that's put under a portfolio with a number of different aspects in it, I think it becomes increasingly challenging to make sure that leadership who are responsible for that have a strong understanding of the actual details of that.
So with corporate leadership or organizational leadership, where would you think the cybersecurity is the best fit? Obviously, I would assume under the IT side, but anything specific, or would that kind of stand alone, on its own?
I don't think there's anything wrong with having cybersecurity under an IT function. I think the issue is that that specific function needs to be incorporated in planning and decision making at the other parts of the organization that are going to be dealing with response as well. So there's nothing wrong with having IT responsible for cybersecurity and a different part of the organization responsible for emergency management or business continuity. However, if you do that, you need to make sure that those functions can still communicate. In a lot of cases, if they're spread out in different parts of the organization like that, with different managers, different focuses happening on their day-to-day business, it's less likely that they're going to communicate. And I don't just mean in an emergency. I mean they're less likely to communicate in actual kind of planning and design activities like that. So if you are going to separate them, that's okay, but there needs to be a real effort put into place to make sure that all these different parts are talking to each other.
Do you have suggestions on how we could do that for organizations? Because I've been at places too, and they have all these different areas. This group looks after emergency response, and this one looks after business continuity. This one does IT, recovery. Do you have suggestions on how to kind of bring those together, even if they are, separate entities? How can you, build the bridges, so to speak, between them?
I think exercises are a great way to do that. And I don't just mean, kind of large-scale, complex exercises, but having an ongoing program with activities that allow these different stakeholders to get together at a lower level first and think through fundamental issues. So, for example, if I run an exercise, the first one that I do where I talk to, cybersecurity and emergency management at the same time, that's not going to be a complex, realistic simulation with actors and things like that. It's going to be a lower-level tabletop where we're just talking about our most fundamental processes. Can we talk to each other? Can we communicate with each other? Even if it's something just as simple as, do these different functions know who in the organization is responsible for this? Do they know how to get them on the phone? While that seems extremely low level, starting off with those kind of activities at least prepares you to have some kind of a coordination in effect when you actually are responding to an event. Certainly over time, I would suggest increasing the complexity of that. So ideally looking at a program that looks at kind of 3 to 5 year cycles, gradually increasing complexity, gradually bringing in more stakeholders in the organization. I think that is probably the best way to start establishing those bonds. But overall, it really needs to begin with just communication as well and talking to each other and figuring out both, one, what are your problems? And two, how do you respond to these problems just among yourselves?
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. We're going to get into some of the teams, and integration and incident management stuff in the next segment. But you touched on the communications. That's pretty basic, right? Understanding what each other does. Cybersecurity, it sounds so complex, but it comes to getting everybody working together. It comes down to communication, which is one of the most basic things there is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if that works, well, then, hopefully you can move forward and create better, stronger teams, which we'll touch on again shortly.
Right.
So with cybersecurity, are there any kind of, I'm trying to set the stage into the next segment here. So, skills or kind of people that, need to be involved, or specific equipment that kind of gets involved with cybersecurity?
In terms of specific equipment, I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. If you're asking about specific people to get involved, I think you really do need to get the senior management in terms of the overall decision makers involved, and especially at the kind of higher executive level. And when I say get them involved, what I really mean is that they need to understand how the organization as a whole should respond. Because, if you have this structure in place about, exactly laying out how the organization is going to respond to a flood or a business continuity outage and stuff like that, and then you kind of throw that all out the window because cybersecurity hasn't been engaged in that I think becomes very problematic. So just getting people at the top to understand that, these are all different parts of a whole. There is a structure in place that ideally will let the organization respond effectively as a group or as an entity. And it's important to have that same process for any kind of disruption, not just for physical threats like floods.
Okay. Well, on that, we've come to the end of our first segment. We're talking with Douglas Grant, and we're talking about cybersecurity and crisis management, lessons learned from integration. We'll be right back. And welcome back to the show. We're talking with Douglas Grant, and his CRT presentation that was really well received, called Cybersecurity and Crisis Management, Lessons Learned from Integration. Douglas, before we went away on the first segment, something just kind of jumped in my mind. I was wondering about getting your thoughts on change management and project management, because I know we were touching base on cybersecurity being new and integrating all these different groups components together, and I wonder getting your thoughts on those two areas, because if something gets through one of those areas that cybersecurity, for example, doesn't know about, it could cause a lot of problems. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be on, integrating with those areas.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and that's actually something that I bring up frequently when people ask me about lessons learned from other emergency management projects. So the reality is that a lot of the conventional training programs for emergency managers that are in place right now, so if you went to school at kind of a university or college level to take emergency management, they really don't focus on project management. And over time, I've come to see that I think that's a critical flaw in the training programs that are available right now. And two, that having an effective project management plan is really going to be one of the major aspects that determines whether you're going to be successful or if you're going to fail. So if you look at the types of change management plans that are happening right now for emergency management, especially if you have an organization that really has not done this a lot before, just the amount of change and disruption and complexity that implementing an emergency management system can cause can be extremely difficult for many organizations to endure. So if you think about what emergency management, and I keep saying emergency management, I really mean that in the sense of any kind of resilience program. So business continuity, crisis management, emergency management, they impose a new structure on an already existing organizational structure. So it's almost like you take what you have in place in an organization now, and you then say, okay, if something bad happens, we're going to take everything that you do on a day-to-day basis and do something completely different. And for a lot of organizations, that's just not realistic, I think. So having a project management plan and a change management plan where, one, you clearly identify what the end state of this initiative is and what the objectives are, and then follow that with an extremely detailed, logical plan of deliverables, timelines, budget. I think that's really getting to be the point, getting to be the only way that you can actually accomplish this in broader organizational terms. Because I certainly have seen it where that stuff is not in place. And the result is that these programs are never as effective and never really get to the point where people want them to be.
And even if you do get them, where you want them to be, and I've seen it happen, somebody comes along, makes a change somewhere, or, a new project comes along and makes changes to, configurations and things like that. And before you know it, you've got problems, and all of a sudden all your disaster teams are now initiated. You've opened yourself up to, exposure, I think is the term everyone uses.
Yeah.
And that just causes problems.
I actually just wanted to make one more point about that. A lot of the activities that take place in emergency management right now, they're done in a way that focuses on the relationships that you build in this field, the relationships you build with other stakeholders. And I certainly think that's important, and I think that's a critical aspect. But at the end of the day, exactly like you're saying, you need something that's a backup. It can't just be as simple as, hey, we said we're going to do this and we'll do our best, because exactly, things change and other priorities come up. At least if you have some kind of a detailed project management plan, if there are other disruptions that happen or other priorities that do come up, ideally you'll at least have something that you can fall back on and say, okay, can we still implement this with some changes, or can we push the deadlines back? But, if you're not having those kind of structures in place and you're just kind of saying, well, we're going to do this and we're going to, do it in a way where everybody is kind of doing it in their free time, I just don't think that's going to be successful.
No, yeah, I've seen it happen and I know it's not. So let's move to the next part, the incident management system. Now, what do you mean by that? What should it include, and all its various characteristics? Because this was one section of your presentation that really grabbed my attention because there was a lot of good bits of information in here. So let's start off with, defining what is an incident management system.
So an incident management system is the term that's used in a lot of different organizations for essentially the structure and the organizational chart for how they're going to respond to disruptive events. And it's based on the idea that, an emergency or a disruption is not day-to-day business, and it requires a separate structure than what is used for kind of those daily operations. It requires something that's a little bit more agile and nimble. The exact definition varies. That's one of the problems of this. When we think of incident management system, especially in the context of some of the doctrine from places like the Disaster Recovery Institute, a lot of it is referring to the incident command system. Now, incident management system technically is kind of a catch-all term for a number of different similar systems that focus on the incident command system as the foundation. And the incident command system was initially a structure that was developed in response to wildfires in the state of California back in the 60s, I believe. And it was taking this idea that for major events where you're looking at kind of cross-boundary or cross-border incidents that require a huge number of different stakeholders to get involved in, there needs to be a specific structure on that focuses specifically about how all these different pieces can function together. Now, that started to be seen as a best practice in a lot of organizations. The issue, I think, is that the incident command system especially, it requires a lot of organizational features and characteristics to be successful. And it's being pitched because there's not really a lot of other stuff out there. There are some competing systems like gold, silver, bronze police model. But in North America, for the most part, it's the incident command system. Now, you're seeing a lot of the stuff out there saying that you need an incident management system to respond to emergencies. Fair enough. I would agree with that. But the incident command system is not going to be a great fit for everything because it's very focused on municipal level first responders. And if you look at the average organization that needs business continuity, it doesn't really have most of the features in place that you would find in a municipal first response agency.
So what you mentioned specific characteristics and components. What can you give us some examples of what those would be?
Sure. So standardization is huge. So the idea that all different aspects of the organization that are performing a role perform it in exactly the same way. Having chain of command or an effective chain of command that clearly outlines who is a decision maker. Transfer of command, so the way that one decision maker steps back and briefs in another one to come and take over that same role. Management by objectives, so making sure that your organization is responding to the most pressing kind of issues first. Having effective information management, for example, so how is the organization both taking in information and sending it out to other stakeholders. So there's a number of features and principles that make the incident command system effective, but there's a number of features as well that make it more suited to those kind of first response agencies. So, for example, if you're taking incident command training, much of it is going to focus on the bureaucratic structure of ICS. So it's a very documentation-heavy system, and a lot of that documentation is just not really a great fit for like a bank, for example. So, let's say that a bank wants to implement ICS and they want some ICS training. Suddenly, half of that training is talking about, how do you requisition aircraft to go and put out a fire? That is a structure that's not really appropriate for a bank and is not really a great fit for an organization that doesn't have first responders. So
Mm-hmm.
There are ways to adapt that system and implement it. If you just look at those kind of core features about, we're going to do everything the same regardless of who's in the room. We're going to have a structure for sharing information and for conducting different kind of briefings and handovers. Those can be effective for an organization, but if you start talking about implementing core ICS in an IT organization or a financial organization, that's going to result in a number of issues where you have that kind of culture shock, and you're giving them an approach and a toolbox of things that they're not always going to fully understand, especially if you don't have that advanced subject matter expertise in this kind of a system to guide that implementation.
Well, I remember working at one place. They had one incident response, crisis management team. I forget their actual term that they use. And they had one team, and it was made up of lots and lots of people. But depending on what the situation was, not everybody needed to be involved. So, and they
Right.
had, we had a 411, which they called, just like up here in Canada. I don't know about the rest of the world, but if you dial 411 here, it's information. So if something happened, didn't need to activate everybody. It was a 411, and everyone was just kept in the loop. If it escalated to something worse, it became a 911. And that's the number that everyone over here calls for emergencies. And that would involve different people. But all the roles and responsibilities were all the same, and it fit to exactly what they needed. They just, had one process, but not everybody needed to be involved with every situation.
Right.
So I have a question for you. Why should I implement ICS? What would be some of the reasons that I would want something like that?
Well, the reasons to implement it is that you can have an effective structure that essentially minimizes the disruption and the unforeseen aspects and the chaos that follow a disruption. So, having a system in place that clearly defines who is doing what in the organization, how they're going to talk to each other, how they're going to share information both internally and externally, how they're going to manage the bureaucratic side of things, so, paying for things and securing equipment, having a logical structure that is not day-to-day business that allows you to be faster and more nimble. Those are all reasons why you would want to implement the incident command system. But I would say or caution, however, that, the question is, do you need the incident command system in its original structure that's designed for wildfires? Or do you just want to take a variation of that system that uses that kind of toolbox approach that takes some of those key structures and key features and apply that to your organization? So it depends on what kind of organization you are, but for the most part, I would probably say that implementing it as originally envisioned is probably not a great fit. Implementing a system that allows you to take some key features of that and impose some order on the chaos of a response is probably a better idea.
Okay. Is there any reasons why I would want to? Let's go the other side. If those are some of the reasons that could impede me, so to speak, are there reasons why if I looked at it and go, hey, this has got all this stuff, all these communication channels, it's got all these roles and responsibilities and everything. Are there challenges with putting that together? Are there things that, all those challenges, that's not a good fit for me because of these reasons?
Sorry, can you say that again? You're kind of cutting off a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. With all these different aspects of ICS, I could be happy with what I see. It's got all these communication channels. It's got all these different processes in place. But these are the challenges that I'm facing to do that. So, is it a good fit for me? Like, is there anything that I should be aware of that would say, what, if I need, 10 years to put this together, is that really what I need? Like, is there a list of things that people could look at and kind of say, that doesn't really fit for me because of this?
Well, I've created my own kind of list. I would say one of the challenges that exist out there is that, and you raise a good point, there's really not a lot of guidance for how to implement this. If you went and looked at kind of the source material, there isn't those kind of check marks about, do you have this, this, and this? Well, then ICS is great for you. I would say from my own personal experience, the checklist to me would be, do you have actual dedicated tactical response resources? So by that, I mean people who are those kind of boots on the ground responders. And I don't mean that you need to have, your own industrial fire brigade or your own internal security force, but do you actually have physical response type people who are going to be carrying out the minute details of fixing the problem, not just providing that kind of strategic direction? One of the major ones, obviously, is do you have a regulatory requirement? There are places now that are starting to have regulatory requirements that either force the implementation of ICS or strongly suggest it, but are not quite at the point where they're saying you must have this. Do you have the resources for lots of training and exercises? You gave the example before of a disruption in an organization where they had a lot of people who were coming into the room and getting involved. If you think of all the people in an organization who could be involved in a disruption, do you have the patience and the time and the resources to provide effective training for all of those people? And by effective training, I don't mean, a one-day session. You're probably looking at overall, a couple of weeks total for every single one of these people, as well as an ongoing commitment to additional training and exercises. Do you have staff that have enough experience with this system to provide expertise? One of the issues that I've seen a lot of is that organizations will try to implement this. They're kind of looking at the doctrine and the materials that are in place, but there's nobody there to give them advice or to provide some guidance about what they could actually expect day to day. So if you don't have those kind of things, or if you do have some of those things, those to me would be the ideas about why you may want to implement the system. If you do have regulatory requirements, if you do have all those resources, if you do have people who can provide that guidance, the system is probably going to work for you, or at least you'll be able to establish a structure or a variation of it that'll be successful. If you don't have any of those things, then I would say that it's probably not a good fit for you.
Well, I like your comment about the one-day training session. A one-day, 1 hour type thing. That's just an awareness session. That's not training.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that I've seen recently as well is that if you look at the core training programs that exist right now, to get somebody from fresh off the street to at least certified up to the higher levels of incident command, you're looking at about 5 days. And 5 days of training, well, that doesn't really seem like a lot. I remember one event where we had the management team of an organization in the room, and if you're thinking about everybody in the room being a director or a senior manager for 5 days straight in training, that's a lot of salary that you're putting into training. So if you have 20, 30, 40, 50 people like that who need this kind of training, and it almost ties back to the project management plan. Just keeping track of that much salary can be a bit of a sticker shock for a lot of organizations.
And I think that's a good point to end on for our second segment. We're talking with Douglas Grant, cybersecurity and crisis management, lessons learned from integration, and we'll be right back. And welcome back to the show. We're talking with Douglas Grant, cybersecurity and crisis management, lessons learned from integration. And Douglas, in the last segment here, I'd like us to talk about the operation cycle. You had a great chart, if I recall, on the conference, and you called it the planning P. I remember the graphic. Can you kind of walk us through what building an operation cycle is and what it contains?
Sure. So full disclosure, the planning P is one of the basic components of ICS. It's one of the things that everybody who takes ICS training would be exposed to, and it's really the structure that ICS imposes upon an emergency management operation. So one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that when I had put it into my presentation, it was really, to me, kind of an afterthought, but I had a couple of people come up to me afterwards, and they were really blown away by it, and they were kind of saying, wow, I can't believe you thought up this amazing idea or this amazing structure. And I was kind of thinking to myself, like, well, one, I didn't think this up. This is, a very widely used emergency management methodology. But two, it kind of demonstrates that the things that are just fundamental day-to-day work for people in, resilience and continuity is probably not really familiar to a lot of people who are focused on areas like cybersecurity or IT. And having all these people from those more kind of IT-focused disciplines at this conference look at this and say, wow, this is really great, I think really shows that, we do need to do a better job of communicating with each other and bringing all parts of an organization into a cohesive framework. So the idea of the planning P is that a response operation should be cyclical. So if you just think of the letter P, the little stick on it, there's a couple of activities that should take place during the initial hours of an incident or disruption. And those are kind of those first notifications, getting everybody in the room together, making sure that the proper stakeholders are informed of the situation. But once everybody has actually assembled in either the decision-making center that an organization would have, like the physical space, or any kind of like a virtual center where people can just communicate and respond effectively over distance, the flow of activities should really be cyclical. And it's easy to overlook that when you're actually in some kind of a response. And especially if you're kind of an outsider, everything just seems like chaos, but there's actually a flow of activities. And the first is kind of to develop your overall strategic approach about how you're going to respond to a disruptive incident. So different versions of the planning P go into a different level of depth about this, but overall, if you're just kind of like an organization that's not heavily focused on emergency management, I would just say that the first thing that you're going to do is figure out in broadest terms how you should actually respond in terms of like what you want to accomplish. So if there's a fire, the first thing that you're probably going to think of is, well, we need to put out the fire, or we need to, get everybody out of the building. So you're not really jumping in and focusing on, all of these detailed actions just yet. You're just starting to get your head wrapped around the kind of broad strokes. So as you go along this cycle, you start going in a little bit further depth. So while an organization that I've worked in before, like a nuclear power plant, may have those response resources to actually go in and put out the fire independently, if you're a bank, for example, it could be as simple as saying, well, the first thing we're going to do is alert the authorities to how and they're going to actually come in and deal with that event. Depending on what the nature of the disruption is, you may be able to respond to it independently, or you may not be able to respond to it independently. If you look at something like an actual cybersecurity intrusion, in broadest terms, it would probably be something along the lines of, we want to stop the intrusion. Well, then you start thinking about how you're actually going to do that in terms of the more operational details. Well, we have an IT department with cybersecurity practitioners. We need to get them mobilized. They need to, get into work. We need to get them into a space where they're capable of actually responding to the disruption, and we need to figure out what they need. So earlier you had asked me if there's any kind of specific equipment that would be needed to respond to a cybersecurity disruption. Mm-hmm. So I don't know the answer to that, but maybe the cybersecurity practitioners do, and they realize that we need a piece of equipment to do this. So the next thing you should be focusing on is how would we actually secure this equipment, or how would we bring in the resources that people need to deal with this? When you go a step further beyond that, it probably looks like, well, the cybersecurity practitioners are going to need to spend at least an hour figuring out the source of the intrusion. They're going to do that by doing X, Y, and Z, and in order to support that, they need to get this piece of equipment. So at that point, you have kind of a rough plan. Now, it's not a particularly detailed plan, but you at least understand what you need to be doing for the next little bit of time. In the hardcore emergency management world, that would be called an incident action plan. You don't necessarily need to call it that as part of an operational cycle, but now you've talked to all the stakeholders in the room and you've figured out what your direction is going to be for the next period of time. So next you would essentially say, how much time do I need to get this into place? If you're in the early stages of an operation, I would say it's probably a short period of time. So you need like an hour, for example. You then spend the rest of that hour actually executing that plan and trying to get into place all of the details that you've identified as needing to take place. And then once that's complete, you can evaluate and say, do I still need to do additional things, or has this plan worked? If you're still at a point where you need to get the work done and the practitioners themselves just need more time to address the task, then you just go into another cyclical period. And around you go until you actually either solve the problem or you realize that your plan isn't working and you need to adjust. So that's really what an operations cycle is. It's the idea that there's a series of structured activities that take place as opposed to just kind of a constant melee of getting all of these different stakeholders together.
I like how you mentioned, people, the cybersecurity people, they have to go away for an hour and do whatever it is they do, X, Y, and Z, for 1 hour.
Right.
And it helps identify, if these people are doing this, don't bug them. Don't be asking for more updates from them, or you're just delaying it. And I guess that would come out of a strong leader or, roles and responsibilities to not do that, so someone takes control of it?
Yeah, and I think that's a hugely important piece of the puzzle. So in advance, having a cybersecurity program that's implemented into a broader continuity framework where we're saying that we as an organization have the discipline to give people the resources they need to fix the problem, but then let them go and do the work to do it. So there's a time to talk about things and to plan, but after a while, you just need to step away and let the practitioners do what they need to do. So if they come back after an hour and say, this is not working, like we can't do this with the equipment we have, or even if it's just as something as simple as, we need food, or we've been working for 2 days straight and we need more people to come in, at that point you can re-examine your plan and come up with something new. But if you come up with this idea of, this person's going to do this person's going to do this, you need to actually step away and let them do it, because the more time you spend bugging them and, asking them follow-up questions, that takes away from their ability to get the job done.
And just to clarify, what stepping away, you're not stepping away from the incident, you're stepping out of the way of the people who need to do what they need to do. Because I know someone's going to say something and send me an email about that.
Yeah, exactly. You're just having the discipline to let people work and not bug them every 5 minutes to see if the situation has changed.
Yeah. So, would the same thing occur during exercises? Would that be the best way to do it as well, or would it be more hypothetical? Okay, you're going to be doing this for an hour, or would you actually kind of, simulate it? Make people wait for an hour and see what happens and what really goes on in the background.
It depends on the type of exercise. I would say that the approach that you've just outlined is the way I would ideally like to see it done. And it certainly does happen that way in some larger scale exercises that take place over 24 or 48 hours. There's going to be peaks and valleys of activity. The issue that I've seen in some places is that they do exercises so rarely and they don't have enough resources to do them, in kind of real time, that you'll get, a half-day exercise where they're trying to simulate a week of stuff happening. So the result of that is that you don't have that time to kind of step away and let people work, and people are just getting new injects and new events happening all the time. When you take that approach, I think that really is kind of a limiting factor because it doesn't allow people to get that discipline of stepping away because it just generates too much chaos.
Well, I guess that would be like information overload. You're
exactly.
just sitting there and people are throwing scenario at each other and all this and that going back and forth, but nobody's really investigating anything then.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I've certainly seen some exercises where you have people who, because it's that information overload, they have like one phone in each hand and both of them are up to their ear and they're trying to listen to two people at the same time. It's kind of difficult to wrap your head around, but in my opinion, the best exercises are those kind of slow and steady. And they challenge people and let people work through problems. But if you're just kind of shotgunning information at them like that, they never really get that chance to actually investigate and figure out the best way to do things.
Well, and at the same time, when you do have these various groups, you mentioned quite a few, they need to step back and say, what's our plan? Especially if something new does crop up. You give an example where a team says, we need more people. Well, or more time. Then what are all the other teams going to do in the meantime? They have to be able to step back and, I don't want to say replan, but say, okay, what does this mean to us?
Right. And those people, I think, actually don't get exercised enough. So if you have one kind of big event and you let those people step away and think about it, and maybe you have like a couple of small changes, yeah, they can adjust on the fly. If you just have that kind of like every 2 minutes something new is coming up, you're right, the plan just changes constantly. You never actually get to focus on the plan. And I'm not sure how realistic that would really be, unless it's some kind of like an earth-shattering cataclysm. Yeah, there's going to be an initial push of activity where things are really chaotic. But after that, things are going to kind of settle down a little bit. And there could be more activity or more frantic periods later on. But, from what I've seen, real emergencies are not just constant shotgun of information like that. There is a tempo to them.
Mm-hmm. So one last point. We've only got 3 minutes left, believe it or not. Wow, time flies by. Can you give a brief chat on crawl, walk, run? I thought that was an interesting little nugget you had at the end of your presentation.
Sure. And so crawl, walk, run is kind of the standard terminology for exercise progress, and the idea that you're having a series of exercise activities that take place over a longer period of time. So the way that it's often described is that crawling is kind of the most basic roles and responsibilities and who does what. Walking is kind of a realistic situation, and then running is like that frantic, new thing happening every 2 minutes. I actually think that's almost too intensive. I think that crawling is those fundamental conversations about can we actually communicate, the most basic processes, and examining if the structures and the organization support any kind of communication. And then walking, to me, is kind of a very low-level roles and responsibilities and who does what. And then running is actually, like a simulated event that is challenging, but allows people to realistically wrap their heads around what they would have to do in a disruption.
So we have 2 minutes left. Do you, and I'll give you 1 minute, so do you have any closing comments you'd like to say on lessons learned and all of this?
Really, the closing comment that I say to a lot of organizations is that the level of effort and the level of success that you can realistically seek to achieve or hope to achieve in a disruption is probably less than you think it is. And that's okay, but the way that you strengthen that is by taking slow and steady approaches and accepting that it's going to take time to become effective and to get your people trained to a level where they can function effectively in a disruption. If you just kind of throw very high-level intensive scenarios at people right away, they're not going to learn, but they're also going to burn out. They're going to think that this is too scary and big and challenging, and they're not going to want to keep doing this kind of stuff. So if you are taking the approach of, having a planning and training program, it's better to just go very slow and work people up from the bottom and just accept that there's going to be limitations because your people are going to be more prepared that way.
That's good advice. Hopefully everyone's listening out there. Douglas, thank you very much for joining us and talking about cybersecurity and crisis management and the incident command system and lessons learned and all your ideas and thoughts that you've given us. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
And I'd like to remind everyone, if there's a topic you want us to talk about, please feel free to send me a note. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks again, Douglas, for joining. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everyone.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.